Thanks for hopping on this. I know this is the first time you're doing virtual homework lecture note taking with me in class. I want to be clear, I am recording this on July 26th or whatever it is. Hopefully, nothing weird's happened with our schedule early in the year or with Center Grove. I highly doubt it. History is the history, notes are the notes. So, my guess is you'll be watching this and this will fit right in. But if there's something I'm not mentioning that's like needs to be mentioned, that's why my guess is it's not going to be an issue. As you dive into this with chapter 4 and 5, let's be sure as we list them follow along, and I'll kind of mention it again at the end of this, that we want to see what the key things from this combined 4 and 5 chapter lecture, uh, how America is developing its own unique identity that is separate than the one that is associated with England and the English crown and the early days of Jamestown and Plymouth Rock, and has turned into something that is distinctly theirs and not something that is uh, an extension of a European power, if that makes sense. A lot of you already know this already before I hop in. Certainly, there are different speed options, I believe. I wouldn't necessarily do this on 2.0, but hey, 1.25, 1.5, maybe not the worst thing in the world. I honestly think sometimes when I rewatch these things, I'm better with a little bit of a voice speed up, but if it's too distracting, sped up, then just watch it normal on 1.0. We've mentioned before how Virginia and Maryland benefited immensely from tobacco as a cash crop, but it was far from glamorous and it was flawed in terms of the need for free and cheap labor to be able to excavate all the tobacco that was going to be grown there, as well as issues with diseases, hot summers, and a weirdly disproportional, is that even a word? Disproportional. There we go. Like 6-to-1 at times, guy to female ratio, which you might chuckle at initially, but it created all kinds of issues with frustrated males not being able to find wives to marry, have kids with, have farm ownership, and it created kind of a tense cultural climate in the Chesapeake with a lot of young males, not enough family building. That can create issues in a societal sense, even though there's this cash crop that's being developed. Indentured servitude, not to be confused with slavery, often associated with young, down their luck males coming over from Europe, not Africa, to work for a short contract, sometimes up to 7 years, the number I always think of, with the idea that after your free labor on the farm, you would have a little slice of America given to you. Those results were a little murky at best, but it was the initial idea for free labor on some of these growing farms, especially in Chesapeake states like Maryland and Virginia. Speaking of growing farms, both of those colonies employed something called the headright system, which rewarded masters with about 50 acres of land for each individual indentured servant that was brought over from Europe, that they brought over. Now, this would be the point I'd ask somebody in class, who's going to benefit the most from this headright system? And all of you smart kids would quickly recognize that the headright system is an unbelievable opportunity for the people that already own farmland, not so much the indentured servants. Because if you can bring over 4 indentured servants a year for 7 years, that's 200 acres a year times seven. What is that, 1,400, something like that? I don't teach math. I'm not good at math out loud. That is an unbelievable amount of acres of land that you can add and multiply. It's like compound interest to the land that you already own, which led to, yes, a lot of indentured servants being brought over. 3/4 of all European immigrants to the Chesapeake were indentured servants by the end of the 1700s. But it's going to create a culture and dynamic of the rich getting wealthier, their land size increasing, and the amount of land left over for indentured servants after their contracts were up continually getting less and less in terms of availability, especially when the West hasn't been explored. You can't just pack up in a U-Haul and go out west or anything to build your own farmland quite yet. So all kinds of issues are being stirred despite the success of the cash crop of tobacco. Now, this is going to lead to maybe the most important story in term from this 2-chapter set. That's going to be the story of Nathaniel Bacon and Bacon's Rebellion, which he is going to be one of those disgruntled younger males in Virginia, and he's going to help lead a frontier revolt In Virginia, so much is going as far as burning Jamestown, causing all kinds of chaos. They're frustrated with the Virginia government for not taking more Native American land that they could have for themselves. And they are creating chaos all across the countryside of Virginia because of some of the issues that were bubbling over from slide number one. And it's going to be squashed when Bacon gets what comes down to bloody diarrhea and dies, and then the rebellion kind of falls apart from there and is quickly squashed. But the lesson here with Bacon's rebellion, not so much of the events, but the impact it has within it. It exposes a class system issue. We certainly have those discussions even in 2023 America within the Chesapeake with the wealthy and the poor. It shows a rebel attitude in the United States. Ironically enough, about 100 years before the Declaration of Independence is written from frustrated rebels. And most importantly, with this in underline, it's going to motivate a different solution to the free labor demands and needs of the cash crop of tobacco in particular. And that new solution will be the African slave trade and the uptick, a significant uptick in the amount of African slaves that are going to be brought over to work some of these farms previously farmed by indentured servants. Don't mistake me flying through this topic like I'm just brushing over colonial slavery. We'll have a lot more on this in the Civil War unit. There's a whole chapter, was it chapter 15 on this matter? But for now, let's go over some basics. About 2 million African slaves were brought over to the New World. That's going to include the Caribbean, South America, Central America, and North America. And speaking of North America, about 400,000 of those is going to be direct to, for the most part, the 13 colonies we know as the future United States. And that number is going to spike quite a bit post-Bacon's Rebellion in the late 1600s. Virginia, South Carolina, Maryland, I throw in there, are going to see huge gains by 1750. And some of the ugliness of slavery, as you might imagine, will quickly emerge. Whether it's the Middle Passage, these cram boats, you watch a video to start next class on, shoulder to shoulder, compressed in, death rates were unbelievably high, shipping captured African slaves across the Atlantic. There were major auction blocks in places like Rhode Island, it's not the Deep South, guys, and in Charleston, South Carolina. I do think sometimes narratives can spread about lack of revolts or slaves kind of accepting their slavery and the tale of slavery in United States history, and that's far from the truth, with examples of slave revolts in New York and in South Carolina in the early to mid 1700s, some of which were squashed and suppressed with pretty medieval and violent techniques on those that were uprising. Slave codes, I've mentioned that with black codes in the sugar plantations in the Caribbean before with early colonization, quickly spread in American colonies that were bringing over significant amounts of slaves, particularly Virginia comes to mind. And yes, if you raise your hand, part of this has to do with racism. That's the easy surface level answer. This is not wrong. Certainly don't mishear me. But the underneath the foundation reason for a lot of this slave code stuff was to enact control through suppression and force in order to avoid a Bacon's Rebellion situation with people burning, through the frontier and stuff because they feel like they're being suppressed. And slavery was a farther suppressing form of free labor, even compared to indentured servitude, which was short-term contracts. So slave codes emerged as a form of suppression and control with the growing slave population that was increasing, specifically in the southern colonies. Get through this stuff. This is kind of our next class, watching a video, Middle Passage things. I do quickly want you to write down mercantilism, which was the idea of the mother country, in Europe, your French, your Spanish, your English, your Dutch, those crowns back in Europe, they're the priority in wealth building, and their benefit and their kind of their increase in power is the priority, even if it comes at the expense certainly of the African populations as well as the ones in the colonies. And the triangular trade, as pictured here, you squint your eyes, kind of looks like a triangle across the Atlantic. It's the Columbian Exchange growing into its full form by 1700, by 1750. And the general notion of it was trading with warring African tribes on the west coast of Africa, and return often weapons and provisions for their war, as well as alcohol would be common. The manufactured goods would come pouring out of the European established powers, and then the raw materials, for the most part, would pour out of the colonies in the Americas. Everybody had things that the other continents needed and wanted, and it's commercial trade starting to emerge continent to continent, and it was kind of the life force of the economies for all of these areas as this kind of new world had been more and more established going into the 1700s. Now we're going to get into some religious stuff, whether it's the halfway covenant, which in 1660s was the emergence of, as younger generations emerged in the older kind of pilgrim philosophy, and New England sort of fizzle out a little bit. Conversations about loosening restrictions on church membership increased in order to get more people to be attending church, kind of create a way where you could be a halfway member, but not a fully committed member, but still be accepted in church, create a little bit of a culture clash. But it was a solution because younger generations were not as committed to the church as the ones that had originally settled in New England. Speaking of New England, 30 years after kind of the emergence of halfway covenant principles, you're going to have the Salem witch trials. A lot of times the Crucible, which is based on these, is taught in junior English classes. In a small Massachusetts town of Salem, there is an hysteric literal witch hunt that emerges after about a few teenage girls actually start accusing people of being witches. It's an absolutely insane story. Think 14 women, 5 males, and like a dog are put to death in a crazy tale of hysterics and emotion taking over logic. I know a lot of times we'll look back at this and say, how primitive these people were in this insane religion kind of gone wrong situation. But if you look at history, there's all kinds of examples, whether it's crazy cult situations in the 1900s. Waco, Texas comes to mind, or even get on Twitter for 30 minutes today, and you'll see examples, maybe not quite as extreme as the Salem witch trials, of people letting emotions and hysteria and lack of factual information create a smoothie, if you will, of chaos online. It's not as dramatic as Salem witch trials, but the idea, it's human nature where hysteria can take us over when there's a lack of reasonable voices in the room. And I would say in 2023, that kind of Salem witch trial energy still exists, even if it's not necessarily hanging people for being alleged witches. So that's a little bit of a sidebar, but I've always mentioned that when you mention the Salem witch trials. In terms of race and ethnic groups, it's not all English and it's not all African slavery, which sometimes maybe the story of the 13 colonies can be taught that way. It's actually an intermingling of different races and ethnic groups, which is going to help create an American identity, not necessarily an exclusive Britain extended identity. Whether it's Scots, Irish, and German, and French and Swede immigrants pulling over to areas like the middle colonies, or yes, they're at society's basement, but natives and Africans are starting to get the label of African Americans or Native Americans as part of these 13 colonies. And with racial mixing and with intermarriage, at some examples, at least with the European immigrant groups, wouldn't have been as frequent, obviously, African to white Anglo or German to African. But you now have babies being born that don't really have an association with the homeland in Europe, and they have parents that are from different ethnic groups. Generally, the South, as we've covered, had an Anglo-English and then African slave racial composition, as you can see in the picture here. The middle, which often was the easiest to establish yourself as a newcomer and was a little more tolerant, also had cities like Philadelphia and New York, probably had the most diversity because of those reasons. And the North, with their kind of tight-knit communities and religious principles, not necessarily known for being ethnically or racially diverse. They didn't have a need for slavery. And as we learned with King Philip's War back from chapter 2 or 3, whichever one that was in, they drove their natives out. So generally, New England was very English heavy and not as accepting and welcoming culturally to other groups as, say, the middle colonies would have been, as you can kind of see exemplified by this picture here, I guess, from 1755. A Couple more quick things. There's going to be an emergence, what many historians call the first mass movement in American history, otherwise known as the Great Awakening in the 1730s and 40s. And it featured emotional, kind of almost like borderline celebrity preachers, like Jonathan Edwards with his famous Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God sermon, which talked about hellfire, and George Whitefield picture here, who allegedly could bring out the emotions and bring grown men to tears and convert tens of thousands of souls to Christianity. While you might see this as feels like a Bible course lesson, many people see it as a new America emerging, and it saw its impact in all 13 colonies, not just a certain region. And it was classless in some ways, and that rich, poor, and everything in between was impacted by this revitalization of Christianity in the American colonies. And it sort of brought Christianity to the people and not necessarily made the church this exclusive thing that only select members were allowed to attend, the way I think of it with like the Pilgrim era of the 1620s and 30s and 40s and things like that. Kind of coming off of that a little bit, there was a culture clash within religion. I've kind of mentioned this indirectly a few times already, and that's going to be the fight or battle and religious grounds between old lights and new lights. Old lights are what they sound like, old heads, traditionalists who were wary of this new style of preaching and teaching that was very emotional and allowing church membership to increase in mass with all of these new conversions that would happen in these Great Awakening style sermons and tent revivals and bring the church to you style of teaching that was associated with like Methodists, with Baptists and Methodists and things of that nature. Whereas New Light, your Whitefield and Edwards styles, were more about traveling to you, emotion, bringing up God's fury and wrath, heaven and hell, very vivid wordplay, and using that to revitalize American religion. And that culture, the New Lights are going to kind of win. The first Great Awakening happens. Its impact is not stopped, but it shows you that within any cultural institution, whether religion or not, there's always going to be a clash from the old way of doing things with the new way of doing things. A few more things as we wrap up here. Education, I always think of primarily early in the colonies as being more of a New England thing than anywhere else. So the middle colonies had, to some extent, education as well. But because of New England's more balance in male-female, more of a family-centric community, and because of their religious principles and longer life expectancy, there was more of an ability and demand and desire for education, which was often primarily focused on training ministers. This is just one example. The South had education to some extent, but because of their agricultural practices and because they're spread out in nature, they didn't necessarily have as much of a focus on it, and their lack of families early on. Harvard, the first college established in New England, the first one in America, was established, 50 plus years before the state of Virginia creates their own first institution in William and Mary in 1693. Little side note, University of Pennsylvania, maybe better known as Penn, is an Ivy League school still to this day. It's the first college created in the United States that did not have any kind of religious affiliation. Thank you, Quaker influence there a little bit, and the more tolerant Pennsylvania culture. But I think the big thing here is New England, if anybody, had more of an education mind and focus in comparison to particularly those Chesapeake colonies that we mentioned earlier in the notes to begin with slides like 1 and 2 and things like that. The colonies were not Athens, and we were not exactly Paris or anything like that early on in terms of academia. There are exceptions. There's Franklin, Phyllis Wheatley, a freed slave, very much known for her poetry. George Washington even read it posthumously, post-death, if I'm saying that correctly. Her work has even taken on more fame. Black female authors often don't get a lot of credit in U.S. history, so I'm trying to do my job there a little bit. John Trumbull, great painter of revolutionary works. There are noteworthy people who were brilliant and smart and contributed to those fields. But for the most part, the 13 colonies were not exactly pursuing academic knowledge and success as they were very young colonies and still growing and developing in nature. There are examples of an America taking form, whether it's John Peter Zinger, who criticized the New York governor and was thrown into jail, who was actually freed under the grounds of he was printing accurate information about the New York governor, and his freedom of press, one of the staple elements of our First Amendment even today, was defended. In politics, England was really hands off until much later in the 1700s, allowing local governments, multi part legislative branches, colonial governors, and things like that develop and control things. And the English crown really was hands off, as I've mentioned before in class, really right up until the edge of a war breaking out. And that's going to allow an American culture to develop. And even things like quilt making and drinking and getting together at pubs and uh, horse racing, cockfighting, all these things that you might scoff at a little bit. It was all these things were bringing American colonists together in ways that they maybe hadn't in generations past. And what you're seeing here, and all the things we've looked at in the last 20 or however minutes this took me to do, you're seeing an American identity developed, whether it's in race and ethnic things, whether it's in pop culture, whether it's in government, whether it's rights of citizens, whether it's in academia with Phyllis Wheatley's poetry. You're seeing a distinctly American identity developed that is generations removed from one that came over with an extension of Europe mindset. Hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully I didn't bore you to tears too much. And this has kind of cleared the deck for us to do some more interactive in-person things in class moving forward. So I'll see you when I see you next time, whatever period you have me. Thanks for following along and getting to the end of these notes.